This is a really great town. So, and what better way to give a talk here than to have everyone have a run on some IPA first. If it gets boring, just the keg's back there. So just head right to it. So I'm Chris, and I've been with Socrata for actually just about 5 weeks now. So I'm pretty much an expert in everything they do. But before I joined Socrata, I was with Governor O'Malley's office in the state of Maryland, where I served as director of the governor's office for the last 6 years, and worked with the governor on a lot of his performance government initiatives and economic development initiatives and international trade and several other areas. So that's probably what we're going to hear a lot about today. So a little bit of my experience, a little bit of the history of performance government, and sort of how it got to where it is today. And so fundamentally, I think that there is a transformation taking place in government. It's being powered by open data. It's being powered by measuring results openly and publicly and transparently for the public to see, bringing the public in and citizens in as stakeholders in the process to help set government goals, to understand and own the data that underlies a lot of the government programs and things that we run. And it's redefining civic engagement. And so Maryland has played a pretty outsized role in the development of some of these performance government initiatives, and so just wanted to talk to you a little bit about how that all took place. And it started in Baltimore City, and if any of you have been there, you've probably driven down a street that looks something like this. And when our governor was, he was first mayor of Baltimore, and when he ran in 1999, Baltimore at that time was the most addicted and the most violent city in the United States of America. And they had gone through decades of population loss. These are some of the boarded up homes that were left behind from the glut of abandoned buildings that were being used by criminals and drug dealers, and there were all sorts of bad things happening in those. And in addition to that, they were driving down property values, which was eroding the city's tax base and giving them even less to work with to sort of try to reverse the trajectory of some of these problems that they had in the city. So when Martin O'Malley was elected mayor, he knew he didn't have very much time to post some quick wins and quick results. And so he looked around at sort of best practices that were happening in the United States. And at that time, New York City Police Department under Bill Bratton, who is now again the commissioner of the police department in New York, had launched a program called CompStat. And CompStat was widely credited with New York City's huge gains in reducing crime. And that was done by organizing police resources, but rather than just through a quarterly or annual budgeting process, but instead bringing police commanders and top brass together with the mayor and together with the top officials in the mayor's office on a weekly basis and putting crimes on a map, understanding where they were targeting police resources, and then reevaluating every single week where are those resources going, until they started to get results. And so the mayor got in touch with the NYPD folks, and they quickly put up a CompStat in the city of Baltimore, and it had the same effect. Baltimore during those years had the largest reduction in violent crime of any major city in America during that tenure. And so they were getting big gains, and they were wondering what was going to come next. And so they sat down and they thought about how they could apply this same philosophy to all the services that a city or a county or a state might deliver. And so after launching another Baltimore first, and that was the 3-on-1 system, they put together a system that they called StateStat. And so StateStat, instead of having your department heads issuing quarterly reports or annual reports and dividing up budgets according to how budgets had been divided up every year, you had the same money for the Department of Public Works this year plus 2%. That's the way it sort of always worked. And they would have a city meeting, and they would say, how are things at the Public Works Department? And they'd say, things are moving along. So they changed that whole process, and they decided to bring in those department heads to meet with the mayor and the mayor's senior team at least once every 2 weeks. And they sat down with all the program directors, and they started cataloging all the data that they were collecting on all their programs, and then began to hold them accountable in person, face-to-face, every 2 weeks. And so if there was a glut of unfilled potholes, they would come back in 2 weeks and ask, why haven't you made progress on these unfilled potholes? And it was face-to-face with the mayor, had to be the department head, and it really started to change the culture around how government was operating at that time. And so the governor, the mayor of Baltimore was elected governor, and so they decided to take that same program and adopt it to the problems that states face, which has its own unique set of challenges. And so that process became known as StateStat. And this is a little more from my time with the governor's office, but we had meetings that looked like this. This is actually just a year in to the administration. We had set our own space for these StateStat meetings. And again, like you have the governor of the state meeting with your cabinet officials, everyone at that table that might be responsible for something. And we were asking that those cabinet agencies had to participate at least every 2 weeks in these meetings. They had to understand that whatever the underlying data was that was being collected about their agency, and they had to be prepared to answer for whatever the data showed according to whatever story the data was telling, whether that was good or bad. And it became a sort of inescapable nexus of accountability for them. And it really, again, started to change the culture. So they couldn't come to a meeting and just say, well, we don't know why that's not right, because they'd say, oh, this program director, they know what's going on with that. Well, then the next time that program director would be sitting there right next to your cabinet secretary answering for, whatever issue was happening in that agency. And so this whole process got started just with a few sort of young staffers with Excel spreadsheets and laptops, sitting down with these agency heads and just understanding, again, and cataloging and understanding and normalizing all the data that they possessed about the programs that they're running. And at the time, it seems surprising, but it is a pretty revolutionary way of doing government. And it's one that's being adapted and iterated and modeled in other states and other counties and other cities all across the United States today. And so the fundamental issue that is at play here is civic trust and public trust. And so people want to know, are their tax dollars being spent wisely? And oftentimes this is sort of treated as a political and rhetorical question. There's a great divide. Whoever's elected is going to say, of course, our tax dollars are being spent wisely. And whoever is running to replace that person is going to say, of course, they are not being spent wisely, right? And so what this process does, and what this open measuring of the results does, is it sort of starts to change that debate. And if you're putting your information online, you're setting goals openly, and you're measuring that progress where people can see you measure that progress, and you're telling them when you're failing and why you're failing, and you tell them when you're succeeding and what's succeeding and how you're using that information, and you're setting tougher goals, you start to actually change the nature of how people understand what their government does and what their place in that government is. So let's see. Some of the results that we got in the state of Maryland, because I haven't been gone that long, so I'm still obligated to pitch the governor everywhere I go. Through the StateStat process, we had shrunk the size of our executive office in the government down to the lowest levels per capita in over 30 years, right? But it wasn't just a process of cut, because all those efficiencies actually allowed us to invest in a lot of the areas that were the topmost priorities for the people of the state of Maryland. And those things are like public schools. We had the #1 public schools in the country for 5 years in a row. And I think it's actually worth pointing out on many of these that this was all done. The governor served his 2 terms as governor during every year of the recession. And one of the largest economic downturns, we came out of that time with the #1 ranked public schools, according to Independent Education Week is who ranked that. Violent crime levels are 30-year lows, so they're tracking with 1973 or something like that. And when he took office, Maryland actually had both the wealthiest state in the country with the highest median income and one of the most violent states in the country with one of the highest violent crime rates. #1 state in the country for entrepreneurship and innovation for the last few years, and that is coming from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which are not always favorable towards Democratic administrations, so we like to highlight that. And we are also one of only 8 states in the country to maintain our AAA bond rating through all the years of the recession. So we're getting really good at measuring performance and understanding how to drive down overtime and how to deliver services to vulnerable populations and make sure that tax dollars were being spent more efficiently. But one of the gaps that started to emerge in this process was how the state was able to tackle larger goals that were bigger than one state agency. You can track how many people your health department is serving at a community health clinic, but it's a lot harder and a lot more challenging to figure out how to measure openly and make progress towards bigger problems like ending childhood hunger, like climate change and mitigating the impacts of climate change. And so just a couple of years into the administration, we looked again for some other, cast a line for some other like innovative ideas that were happening. And we met with Sir Michael Barber, who at that time was working for Prime Minister Tony Blair. And he had come up with a concept called a delivery unit. And so we quickly adapted that delivery unit plan. And what that involves is, at a basic level, is setting larger strategic goals for whatever organization you're dealing with, in our case, the state of Maryland. And those strategic goals included aligning education so that students are graduating with the skills that they need to enter college without remedial courses and enter careers and they're getting the skills that they need to enter careers in college. I mentioned climate change. Restoring the health of the Chesapeake Bay. It was another one of those big goals that every agency in our government essentially has some role to play. And so we had to take this process, and what you do is you identify every single link in the chain every deliverable that could possibly advance the ball on those challenges and those problems. And then you find out who's responsible for every single link in the chain. And then we started to create meetings. Instead of having a Department of Health stat, we started to have climate stats. We started to have hunger stat on childhood hunger. We had student stat to align education, like I said. And then we had Bay stat to address the health of the Chesapeake Bay. And we have job stat and all sorts of stats. But the idea is to get every agency that has a role to play. And in many of these cases, it's every agency, and get them around the table thinking about what it is that they can do and then measuring that performance. It's all online, openly. You can look at the full deliverable plans on climate change or veterans unemployment, and you can drill down to see every single agency, what they're tracking, what they're measuring towards achieving those goals. And so the Chesapeake Bay became one of the, is one I'll just dive into there a little bit if I can get to it. So there's like an example of a Bay stat meeting and a couple of these sort of expanding stat meetings. You can see how many people actually, and so the one in the bottom corner is a good example. I think that's another Bay stat meeting, but in that Bay stat meeting, we actually invited public in, we invited nonprofits in, and we started to actually do a better job of engaging the citizens in determining how to address some of these problems. And so the Chesapeake Bay, as probably everybody knows, has just had generations of decline, and its health is in serious jeopardy. And so, like I said before, every single agency had a part to play in how we're going to tackle that problem. And the federal government had a part to play in how we're going to tackle that problem. And our neighboring states also had a part to play in how we're going to tackle that problem. And so just to give you an idea of how we might address our different agency issues, our transportation agency was charged with mitigating the effects of runoff and using more permeable surfaces instead of impervious surfaces wherever they could. Our agriculture department were incentivizing farmers to plant cover crops that slow down the flow of fertilizers into the Chesapeake Bay. Natural resources was tasked with identifying and mapping out the most ecologically sensitive areas in the state, looking and then using a state program called Program Open Space to start to purchase and put those lands into trust so that they couldn't be developed and harmed over time. And even our corrections department, we had inmates plant more than 1 million trees in the state of Maryland. And they also had inmates building oyster cages. And so their oyster population in the Chesapeake Bay had just been completely wiped out, the native oysters. And so they're in a process now planting over 1 billion oyster spat, and they needed the cages that actually protect them and get them, they need to grow and live long enough to be sort of released into the greater environment. And so they had the corrections agency coming in to help with that. And then additionally, we worked with Maryland and Virginia, Washington, D.C., and the EPA, and through a program called the Chesapeake Bay Executive Council, they actually started adopting these same types of stat-driven measurement programs. And then they actually start, instead of saying, well, we're going to get the Chesapeake Bay up to a grade A health in just 30 years, but without saying how they were going to do it, they started to set 2-year milestone goals so that the current elected leadership could be held to account for their portion of contributions toward Chesapeake Bay health. And so that's our Chesapeake Bay. That's a real critical issue. The state of Maryland and basically the entire eastern seaboard depends on our ability to be able to reverse this declining health and change that trajectory. But for Maryland especially, it's both an environmental issue, it's also an economic issue. We have beaches and tourism, film, shopping, sports, crab cakes, oysters. All of this is sort of dependent on us figuring this out and starting to reverse this decline. And so that's also the Chesapeake Bay. I've got a lot of Chesapeake Bay slides for you. So the next step in this process is the growing complexity that was being driven around this. So we're statting these agencies twice a week. We're running Chesapeake Bay Stat, we're running Hunger Stat, we're running Student Stat. And so we still have now maybe a slightly expanded team, but still a group of young staffers, and they're doing all of this with Excel spreadsheets, and they're, cabinet secretaries are emailing their program managers, and their program managers are emailing analysts, and the analysts are asking questions and sending them back. And there's just this huge sea of data and this huge sea of unmanageable spreadsheets. And here's a few examples of some unmanageable spreadsheets. This is our Department of General Services, just a brief little snippet from our planning, design, and construction. This is a BayStat template, and so you can see all the tabs in the bottom, the enforcement actions, the nutrient management programs, the cover crop programs, what cover crops are being planted in which counties, how many are being planned versus how many are actually planted, the money that's being spent to incentivize farmers to plant cover crops in the winter, all being tracked and maintained. And this is some prisoner reentry, substance abuse. All this is online. You could look at some very, very huge wealth of spreadsheets if you're into that kind of thing. And so we had to figure out how to move beyond what we already had. And what we had already accomplished at that point was routinizing the collection of data, normalizing that data for this process. And then we had to figure out how we could make that data work for us instead of against us, as it became a sort of mountain of data instead of a few loose spreadsheets about crime or violent crime. And so Maryland actually partnered with Socrata and became the first state in the country to launch an open data portal. And that is pictured here. And so what that allowed us to do was start to create real-time live repositories for information that both fuel that internal decision-making process, but as well as providing that same data to citizens, stakeholders, so that they can use that data to, one, measure the performance of their government, if they so chose, but they can also use that data to create their, through APIs, they can also use that data to create their own applications, their own websites. They can pull real-time data and spreadsheets, and they can embed them into, blogs or other websites. And there's a million and one uses, and we haven't figured out all of those uses yet. But the essence of it is that it created an automated process for getting that data regularly updated. And so it's sort of it hasn't quite got there yet, but the idea is that over time, they're going to keep working, and we're going to be able to eliminate that sort of, very sort of faulty process of sending around spreadsheets and shipping things back and forth like that. And it's also giving citizens ownership over the data that is being collected by their government. And so they should have ownership over that data. And again, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent, that data belongs to the citizens, and it should be online for the citizens to access, use in all the various ways that they might use it. And so this is just a quick slide just to sort of demonstrate the evolution of data-driven government. Started out very small, and it's growing. Actually, it's a lot larger than this. I just hadn't got an updated slide. But there are many governments that are both doing that delivery unit style goal setting, that are doing some variation of a stat style government, and ones that are doing open data. And so there's a lot going on in that space, but it's always an iterative process, and you can see sort of how that evolved. CompStat was created to solve a crime problem in New York City. It was adapted by Baltimore, but then they layered on 311, they layered on all the other city services, and then shared that with the world. And then the governor borrowed it from himself, but he borrowed it and adapted it to StateStat, but then they incorporated the delivery unit model, and they started tracking goals that are sort of larger civil, larger public problems than just those basic sort of overtime hours and things like that. And then just as an example, I was in Louisville, Kentucky, where they have a fantastic LouisStat program. They visited the state of Maryland some years ago, and now the mayor there has stood up LouisStat, which is a great program, and I knew it was going to be a really good stat program. But in addition, just because of his own background, the mayor had sort of taken the cultural change aspects of the stat program and really sort of blown those up to larger than life proportions. And so now they have their program managers and all levels of city government have like career tracks where they can do lean and they can get project management certification. And so they're trying to build a career out of people who can take this data and they can use it in effective ways to manage government. And so I thought LouisStat was really cool when I was down there. And so quick little like open data story, you might have already heard it, but New York City just a couple of weeks ago, New York City is another leader in this space. And another good example of how iterative the process is, because New York is doing some really advanced predictive modeling and things like that with their data to shut down slumlords and plan future growth. But that's sort of the next step, and now other cities and states are looking at New York and saying, well, we want to do that, plus we want to do the predictive modeling, and we want to do the cultural change. And so it's just sort of growing and snowballing over time, and everybody's looking at the next state and saying, yeah, we want that, and then we're going to add this on top of it. And so I think that's really cool. And the story from New York was some folks got their parking fine citation information, and they were looking to see where in the city, the sort of most fines were generated. And they tracked it down to 2 fire hydrants that were within a block of each other, which combined had, in 1 year, had issued fines of $55,000. And so they posted this on Reddit to like a New York City like civic subgroup or something. And so then they started using Google Street View, and other people started doing in-person visits and photographing the area. And what they found was there was like a very strange sort of setup there with like a divider between the street and the fire hydrants, but they were also marked as though they had parking spaces there. And so people parked there. And they incurred $55,000 in fines for the right to do so. And so the whole process of the discovery of the data, sharing it with other people because it was interesting, other people investigating, and then bringing the information to the Department of Transportation took about 3 weeks before they had the lines completely repainted. And so that's $55,000 in parking fines somebody doesn't have to pay anymore, which is definitely a quality of life improvement. And so a couple of days ago, I was in San Juan, and it's another good example. So San Juan, Puerto Rico, actually, they just launched, they both have a nascent stat program that under the new governor. And they also just launched, just 5 days ago, their data.puertorico.gov, which is their own open data portal. And I thought it was sort of a compelling case. So I hadn't, other than my work in Maryland, I hadn't sort of been out and able to sort of see these things from the ground level. And it was nice to go to Puerto Rico, but what we saw was that the people there were sort of stunned a little bit. So they got 100 data sets available to the citizens there. And that was through a lot of work, and it just had never been done. Transparency in government is not really like a buzzword in Puerto Rico just yet. But they were kind of blown away that they had access to the data, and you could see that they were almost unsure, like they were being duped or something like underhanded was happening, because they wanted to know, like, well, I have access to this data today, but are you going to take it away from me tomorrow? Are you only posting data that's going to be in like an advertisement for the current administration, or are you actually going to be continually updating this information and giving us the bad with the good? But they were genuinely excited, and the group that sort of got early access to this, plus this little hackathon is what you're seeing here. There's about maybe 90 or so students and entrepreneurs and just civic-minded individuals and government officials that got together, and for the first time ever, they were building apps with publicly available data. They were building better transit apps. Somebody built an app that would email or text message a parent if the student didn't show up for school that day. And so they were very aggressively using these things, and they were genuinely excited and could see the possibilities of where this is going. And so I think, oh, maybe I'm hitting the wrong button. That would help. So this is just a little more, just some sort of basic information about what sort of goes into a data-driven government structure. But the bottom line is I think that the genie is out of the bottle on this one. You guys all probably already know that, but it's such a small percentage of people who are actually involved. And thanks, Alan said it earlier, but this is like a self-selecting group, right? But there's going to come a point when it's pervasive and it's unavoidable, and everybody's doing it is going to make a big difference when every city, every state, every county, the federal government, throughout all of their agencies are all doing this. The wealth of data, we're going to need a lot of data scientists and people who are able to sort of figure out what it is that they can do with this information. And someone had given me the analogy, I mentioned it to me the other day, of sort of like the earliest days of the internet and the World Wide Web. That everybody, the people who were involved, and there were civic, computer clubs and things like that, right, in the very early days. And they could see the potential. They knew they could, link and share information and share it globally, like in an instant. But no one exactly knew what direction all of that was going to go. They didn't know we would have, internet-connected thermostats and that were helping us reduce energy usage. And everything that we have today. It's just fundamentally changed the entire way. There's a McKinsey report that sort of highlights this. They estimated that the value of open data in our lifetime is $3 to $5 trillion in sort of untapped performance resources, economic development resources that are going to come from this sort of revolution that's happened in open data. And so that is my presentation, but I'm here, so I'm open to questions, and I'll even try to answer them.